Afternoon. As a two-time graduate of an HBCU, I want to say thank you to the Benedict College family for greeting us and welcoming us to your historic campus. Mother, wife, author, lawyer, district attorney, attorney general, United States Senator, Alpha Kappa Alpha woman, HBCU grad, fearless advocate, servant leader, and a fearless fighter. It is my honor to introduce Senator Kamala Harris. Throughout her career, Kamala has been a fearless advocate for the voiceless and the vulnerable, and vocal and determined fighter on behalf of all of the people. In 2017, Kamala was sworn in as a United States Senator for California, the second African American woman and the first South Asian American in the history of our country. As a U.S. Senator, Kamala has introduced or co-sponsored legislation to provide sweeping tax cuts for the middle class, addressing high cost of rent, raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, making higher education free for the vast majority of Americans, reforming the cash bail system, protecting the legal rights of refugees and immigrants, and expanding access to quality, affordable health care. She has been a key voice in the fight to hold the Trump administration accountable, asking those tough questions on behalf of the American people and taking the administration to task and against their cruel policies. As California's Attorney General, Kamala prosecuted transnational gangs that exploited women and children. She achieved landmark results for middle class in California by fighting the Wall Street banks, winning $20 billion for homeowners who were facing foreclosure during the Great Recession. She helped thousands of families stay in their homes and passed one of the nation's strongest anti-foreclosure laws. She was proud to be on the team that helped bring down California's Proposition 8 at the United States Supreme Court and to fight for marriage equality nationwide. Throughout her career, Kamala has been a leading advocate for innovation and reform in the criminal justice system. She established the first Office of Recidivism and Reduction and Reentry and pioneered the nation's first open data initiative to expose racial disparities in the criminal justice system. In her 2 terms as District Attorney of San Francisco, she created Back on Track program, which connected first-time felons with job training and apprenticeships. Just 5 minutes ago, I heard Kamala speak to a group of 50 Benedict students, and she attributed her success to her family. And a large part of her family she mentioned as her HBCU family. So it is an honor to introduce the only HBCU grad running for President of the United States, Senator Kamala Harris.
Thank you, Representative James, for your leadership and your voice and always speaking truth. Hello, Tigers. Hello, Benedict College. How is everybody? You good? I know Benedict College likes to talk about how you put the BC in an HBCU, so I'll take that as a proud bison. You know. But I want to thank Mayor Benjamin, who called me. Let's just first deal with the elephant in the room, which is the events of the last 24, 48 hours. Let's just address that. So Mayor Benjamin called me and told me that it was shifting and it was going to change, that he and Dr. Artis had made the decision that it was only right and only a reflection of this most honorable institution that it would be opened to students, this event, that it would not be a paid event, and that everyone would be able to participate. So I want to just publicly thank both the mayor and Dr. Artis for your leadership and for your voice in this. And let me just be clear so you can just hear it from me. I refused to come with the previous sponsorship of this event because, frankly, Benedict students were excluded. And as a proud HBCU graduate, and especially knowing that these times and the challenges of these times, I believe that it was so critically important that the students be present, that their voice be heard, and that it be reflected in a forum on this subject and so many others. But in particular, when we are talking to candidates for presidency of the United States, much less the President of the United States. And also, I said I would not come because I just couldn't believe that Donald Trump would be given an award as it relates to criminal justice reform. I mean, let's be clear. This is somebody who has disrespected the voices that have been present for decades about the need for reform of this system, the people who have marched for justice in this system, the people who have sacrificed to create leadership around justice in this system. And so this being an election in 2020 that I believe very much puts justice on the ballot, and this being a forum for people who are running for president, much less the current occupant of the White House, has to reflect then the fight for justice. And the core of any fight for justice is that you speak truth. That you speak truth. Uncomfortable though it may make some. And let's speak truth. When he compares what's happening around the system for justice in the United States of America, because let's be clear, the framers of the Constitution of the United States of America, which has always been what we have relied on when we fought for justice in the courts. Thurgood knew that, Charles Hamilton Houston knew that, Constance Baker Motley knew that. So let's talk about the Constitution of the United States and the framers of that Constitution, who rightly said there may be a moment where we have someone who has abused their authority in our government. So they created this system of democracy with 3 equal, co-equal, independent branches of government. And then said, because they imagined a moment like this, we will build it in a way there will be checks and balances in case there is an abuse of power. And so right now, we are witnessing through the impeachment process those checks and balances kicking in, as rightly they should, for the sake of the integrity of our system of justice and democracy. But what do we have in Donald Trump? Someone who dares to use the word lynching with the blood that has been poured on the soil of South Carolina and so many places. And dares to talk about his victimization. Well, let's compare it to those who have suffered in a criminal justice system in America that has too often been informed by racial bias and by injustice, and he dares to compare himself to the people who have been at the wrong end of a system that is in need of reform. Well, let's just for a moment, I'm going to offer you a couple of examples to make clear why that it is an inappropriate example in comparison. So when we talk about it, let's look. Donald Trump has been accused in the Mueller report of at least 10 incidents of obstruction of justice. Be clear, because the Mueller report is clear. He was not indicted because there is a memo in the United States Department of Justice that's saying a sitting president cannot be indicted. Were it anybody else, that indictment, I am sure, would have gone through. But in these allegations that are before the impeachment proceedings, he has a team of lawyers. By contrast, 80% of the people charged with crime in the United States of America cannot afford a lawyer. Let's talk about the fact that if he were, like so many who have been accused in the criminal justice system, actually accused the way he refers to himself as being a victim of all of this, well, let's be clear that the accused would be in jail. He's sitting in the White House. Let's also be clear that anybody walking into a courtroom who has been charged with a crime in America today does not have the ability to fire the prosecutor. But yet he tried to fire Mueller and fired Comey. So there is no comparison. And this is on the heels, guys, and this is why I just couldn't come. This is on the heels of a history where he was arguing against the Central Park Five, where he put in place an Attorney General of the United States of America when he became president that has doubled the funding of private prisons, that they have, under his administration, essentially stopped all pattern and practice investigations and stopped all that needs to happen around oversight for police departments that have been in need of reform, right? This is what has happened under this leadership, and this is why I decided not to come. But today the students are here, the public is here, and so I thank you. And so I'm here to talk about what I believe justice is and should look like in America, and what is on the ballot in 2020 in terms of the challenges before us. And my background on this is that I am a child of parents who met when they were active in the civil rights movement. My perspective on this is that I was born into and raised in a community where the inequities, the unfairness, the injustices of the criminal justice system were not something I read about, not something I watched on TV. It was something I lived and experienced. And so when, after attending Howard University and going back home to law school, I made a very conscious decision to become a prosecutor, knowing that the system was in need of reform. And my perspective is that to reform that system, let's be on the inside also, where the decisions are being made and we have the power to do something about it, in addition to all of those smart and forceful advocates who are on the outside. And so I took on the work of doing it. And when I was elected as District Attorney of San Francisco, created one of the first initiatives in the United States focused on young men who, mostly young men, some young women, who were arrested for drugs and getting them jobs and counseling. People said, what are you doing? This was back in the dark ages on these things. I was elected in 2003. People said, what are you doing? You're supposed to be putting people in jail, not letting them out. People said, why are you giving them jobs? We need jobs. People who haven't committed a crime need jobs. And I said, no, this is a system that in particular, this war on drugs has been a failure. It's a public health crisis. It should not be criminalized, and it has led to America's mass incarceration system. When I was Attorney General of the United States, of California, it's a big state. I actually led the second largest Department of Justice in the United States, second only to the United States Department of Justice. And there we did the work of saying that law enforcement needs to be held accountable for what is racial bias. Everybody carries it, but when you carry a gun, when you have the ability to determine that someone will be deprived of their liberty because they will be arrested, then we need to check that. And so we created one of the first in the nation trainings on racial bias that is mandatory for police officers. When I ran the Department of Justice of California, we required, and I required, that all of the law enforcement agents under my control wear body cameras and keep them on full time. These were the kinds of work that we did, and this is part of my background. Now, talking about the future and as we go forward, I have outlined what I believe is one of the most necessary opportunities that we have to reform America's criminal justice system, and as president, what I fully intend to carry out. It is about ending mass incarceration. It is about responsibility and accountability, not only for police, but for prosecutors. It is about doing what we must do to take the profit out of the criminal justice system, both in terms of money bail, but also shutting down immediately those private prisons. And it is about focusing on women and incarcerated women and families, and understanding that in these moments when we're talking about family separation, the criminal justice system of the United States has also, by its system and design, affected family separation, and we need to put it in check and reform it around that as well. So I thank you all for your leadership, and I'm looking forward now to our conversation. Thank you.
I'm Mayor Hardy Davis from the Garden City of Augusta, Georgia, and the president of the African American Mayors Association. And I'm delighted to be here to just take a few questions from the audience. And I've got a few that I'll start with, Senator Harris.
Thank you, Mayor.
You've been a phenomenal leader in the area of criminal justice reform, as you've already said in your speech. All right. I'll start with a simple one that you've already done work in. In your first 100 days, what steps would you take in terms of changing the parole system and opportunities for clemency, particularly around nonviolent offenders?
Yeah, so there's a lot to be done there. I think about it in terms of what we need to do around clemency. I think of it in terms of what we need to do around expungement. And so on the issue of clemency, part of the plan that I have designed would include, we will take considerations of clemency out of the Department of Justice and put it in the White House. Because there are so many of those decisions that are made by the same people who actually were part of what contributed to those sentences in the first place. And I want to make sure that in my administration that there are fresh eyes that are looking on it without any investment in the outcome based on a history of working on it. So that's part of it. I also think I have as part of my plan a real emphasis on what the United States Department of Justice can do to put resources into local law enforcement systems to expedite expungements of records. So for example, I intend to do everything that I know is possible to be done to legalize marijuana. And that will be obviously what happens going forward, but we also have to talk about the thousands of people who are currently incarcerated and what we are going to do about them, because this can't only be forward-looking. In fact, that was one of the concerns that I had about the First Step Act.
That's right.
Was, but it's the first step, and so I will take that first step. But the second step has got to be about looking at what we must do retroactively, because even when we say we want to end mass incarceration, the effects of those systems are present today in the hundreds of thousands of people who are currently incarcerated under a system that was unfair and unjust.
I think that's fantastic. I think that leads to a really important question. You talked about the First Step Act and really what second step should be. There's been a large conversation in many circles with mayors around, especially in our local communities, the decriminalization of marijuana. You mentioned that just a moment ago. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah.
Obviously, state legislatures play a significant role in our ability to affect the lives of individuals, what we can do or cannot do at a local level. What would you do as it relates to that?
So one, legalize it, and at the federal level, many states have, my state California has, many others have, but until it is at a federal level legalized, there's still a lot of issues with either the federal government coming in and overriding the sovereignty of a state on this issue, but also what is happening in terms of, for example, those who have been arrested and convicted under federal statutes, of which there are many. And not to mention the extreme sentences under the federal sentencing guidelines that all need to be reformed. And so legalizing at the federal level, which also means doing what we need to do to create pathways for employment. Because here's the thing about this. We will legalize marijuana. In the states that have legalized marijuana, there are some people making a whole lot of money off of this new industry. It is probably one of the most lucrative contemporary new industries that we have seen in America. And here's the irony of it, and therefore the injustice of it. There are now people making hand over fist in money, doing the same thing, which is selling weed. And meanwhile, all those folks who had been are incarcerated or felons for life. So part of the approach is also to then regulate the industry in a way that we require and create incentives for the formerly incarcerated to be first in line for those jobs, including developing as a priority the skills that are necessary for those people to have the skills to start their own businesses and to be a part of this whole new industry. Because it is, I mean, they know.
That's right.
and listen, it's just literally a matter of equities and righting what has been a long-standing injustice. Because when we look at the decades of criminalization of drugs in America, and then we look at how we're shifting in terms of now understanding the opioid crisis as a public health matter. Now shifting in terms of saying marijuana, CBD. Have you all seen these products with CBD? And we're talking about hemp and all this stuff, right? All of a sudden, everyone's understanding the virtues of all this, right? Practically overnight. Meanwhile, there are still hundreds of thousands of people who have suffered extremely under a system that was about criminalizing this very thing that practically overnight became legalized. So we've got to correct for that, and that's a big part of my vision for how we go forward.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. All across America, particularly in communities of color, black and brown, disproportionately high numbers of incarceration. What are your plans as it relates to bail reform?
So I've actually been a leader on this issue in the United States Senate. And to your point, there are people who are currently sitting in jail all over America for days, weeks, months, even years, waiting to go to trial, simply because they do not have enough money to pay bail. And the way I think about it is that, so they walk into the courtroom and the judge says, oh, this is the bail for that thing. And either they've got it or they don't. So then what happens? Then maybe their family will go across the street to what's across the street from every courthouse in America, the bail bondsman. Well, the bail bondsman says, I'll give you the money. The average bail in America is about $1,000 for the average offense. I'll give you the money, or $10,000 is what I mean, $10,000. So then they go across the street to the bail bondsman. The bail bondsman says, yeah, I'll give you the money, but you've got to give me 10 to 20%, which you don't get back. So that family has to either come up with that money, beg, borrow, and steal to get it, because that's a whole lot of money. We're looking at $1,000 to $2,000, which the average American family does not have. And then if they come up with the money and the family member shows up at court as they're supposed to, they still don't get the money back. By the way, the people who put up bail who have the money, they get the money back if they show up. So there's a premium on being poor in the system. Then let's talk about what happens in addition to the residual consequences. Someone can't pay bail. What does that mean? They're losing time from work. So they'll lose their job. Let's say it's a single parent. What happens then? Child Protective Services comes in and takes those children. Right? All kinds of consequences come up just because somebody does not have the money to pay to get out. So this is a criminal justice issue and it is an economic justice issue. So I decided I was going to find a way to deal with this in a bipartisan way, and I knocked on doors of several of my Republican colleagues, and then I stopped at the door of one fellow by the name of Rand Paul. And I said, Rand, do you want to work on this with me? And he said yes, and we did. And after the word got out about it, I checked in with him like, you good? You still good with this? Your people good? And he said to me, Appalachia loves this. Yeah. Because poor people understand, no matter what their race, this is an economic justice issue. Working people understand, no matter what their race or their geographic location, this is an economic justice issue. So there you go.
That's fantastic. I know the students want to ask questions. I'm going to ask one more before we ask the students. Okay. And I think they'll appreciate this question. We're at the historic Benedict College. All across America, there are conversations about our HBCUs.
Yes.
As our next president,
yes,
what would you do to make sure that we're federally funding HBCUs in a way that we've never done before?
Yes. And I will tell you, it didn't take me to run for president to care about this or work on it. In fact, when I first got to the United States Senate, it was one of my first priorities. And so we got legislation passed, actually, that will increase federal funding to HBCUs around infrastructure rehabilitation, because so many of our schools are so old and the buildings are falling apart. And our kids are going to, bungalows, or, the library is broken down. It's just, it's so we need to do that. So we got that passed. Going forward, I will dedicate $60 billion to HBCUs. 10 will go to continue with the infrastructure support around buildings. But the 50 is going to in particular be focused on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. Understanding that our HBCUs produce and really are the pipeline for so many professions, but in particular these. So it's going to be about that. In addition, there is a pocket of about $2.5 billion in my plan that's going to go to specifically funding educators to teach educators and basically to produce teachers. You may know that if a black child has a black teacher before the end of 3rd grade, they are 13% more likely to go to college. If they've had 2 black teachers before the end of 3rd grade, they're 32% more likely to go to college. So this is something that would have generational impact. So there is that. And then also part of the 60 is going to go to what we need to do to also train black entrepreneurs. Because what we know is that the heartbeat often of our neighborhoods and community are those small business owners who are not only business leaders, but they're also civic leaders. They hire locally, they train, they mentor. And so what we need to do to help people develop the skills to become a successful entrepreneur. So that's all part of my HBCU plan.
That's fantastic.
Thank you.
That's fantastic. How about a few questions from the students?
Yes, let's hear from the
I
students.
think we've got a few questions from students. Yes. A microphone, please. Okay, we're starting in the rear. Yes.
Hi, my name is Amber Cooper McFadden. I'm a 3rd-year student here at Benedict College. The incarceration of women is at a historic high around the United States, of which many mothers and caregivers. Incarcerated women has a ripple effect of families and communities. What are some of the proposed solutions to end mass incarceration of women?
Yeah. So that's a wonderful question. You'll see that in my, it really is a plan of action. Incarcerated women are a big area of focus for me. 90% probably of women who are incarcerated are mothers. An equal number of incarcerated women, probably 90% at least, have experienced some form of violence as a victim of violence, including child abuse. We have seen since 1980, I think it was a 4-fold increase in the number of incarcerated women in America. As a system, when women are sent to prison, it is often without regard to the geographic location in terms of the distance between them and their children. If you go, and this applies to men and women, if you go to a prison, you will see that if somebody who is incarcerated wants to make a phone call to a family member, there are private companies who run those phones and charge exorbitant prices. So everything about this system works against the best interest of in particular incarcerated women, of those women and their children and their families. So there are a number of areas of focus for me in this. It's about, one, the conditions of incarcerated women. I've been a leader on that in the Senate already, which is there are still states where women are shackled while they're giving birth. There are issues about women having access to feminine products that they need. So real dignity issues. And that's about while they're incarcerated. The other area of focus for me is to actually require and do an assessment every time, and require this, of the distance a woman will be from her children. The other approach that is, in addition to that I advocate and will lead, is what we need to do to allow women to have weekends and overnight visits with their children. Because the reality is, women, as a general matter, when they're incarcerated, is not for life. It is for a period of time. And they want to be able to bond with their children and maintain that relationship, but it becomes increasingly difficult for them to do that, especially because it's also an economic justice issue. So these are all the ways that I think about it, including what we need to do to get more services for all people, but again, back to your point of the question, women around mental health, counseling, and support. Because frankly, when they go into the prison, they have already experienced an incredible amount of trauma. And when they come out, that trauma has only been compounded. And we need to address that. So those are some of the things.
Our next question.
Hey, how you doing? My name is Henry Peterson III. I'm a junior here at Benedict College, business administration major from Wagner, South Carolina. I know y'all ain't asked for a biography, but there you go.
I wanted it. Mr.
We're here.
Peterson the third.
Yes, ma'am. We're here for a criminal justice reform forum. And I believe that in the African American community, the best way to improve criminal justice is by keeping our kids from becoming criminals in the first place.
Yeah.
And coming from the backwoods of South Carolina, I can see how a lackluster education system can lead to criminals. So my question for you is, what's your plan for improving the education system, the public education system nationwide?
I appreciate that, Mr. Peterson the third.
Excellent question.
That's so great. And so to your point, I think part of it is we have to be clear about our goal. So people will often say the goal is safe communities. I disagree. The goal should be healthy communities. Because when you have a healthy community, you will have a safe community. And so how do we achieve healthy communities? We invest in affordable housing. We invest in public health, including mental health. We invest in the economic opportunities that are in those communities. We invest in the public education systems that are in those communities. It's not rocket science. And when you do that, you will have safe communities. So part of it that I encourage is that we stop letting people talk about the goal is safe communities, because automatically then people think, well, for safe communities, I know where that happens, law enforcement.
Right.
No. You want safe communities, back to Mr. Peterson III, then it's about focusing on what creates for healthy communities, including our public schools. And understanding that 70% of the prisoners in the United States today, 70% are high school dropouts. That's not a coincidence. There's a direct link. So what are we doing about that? Let's look at, that's why public education is such a big focus for me. What are we doing about that? Let's deal with a number of things. Let's deal with, right here in South Carolina, over 5,000 teachers left the profession last year. Why? Because they cannot afford it. Because there are so many teachers working 2 and 3 jobs, because the teachers in our public schools, 94%, coming out of their own pocket to help pay for school supplies. Because teachers on average make 11% less than similarly educated professionals. So let's deal with that. And I have a plan to actually be the first in our history to close that teacher pay gap by putting a federal investment in to close that teacher pay gap. Let's deal with the fact that we're funding our schools. Thank you. That we fund our schools in large part based on the tax base of that community. Now let's think about that for a moment. So that means the community with a hefty tax base gets hefty resources. Right. Meanwhile, the school district that may have a lower tax base gets fewer resources, even though they have the highest needs often. So that's about thinking about that. It's about looking at, here in South Carolina, what do we need to do? Well, I know what we need to do. And it's putting an investment, a meaningful investment in broadband. Why? Because, gone are the days, I'm going to say this to a certain group of people in here, gone are the days of being able to do your homework with Encyclopedia Britannica. That don't work anymore. That dog don't hunt. Okay? And so it's about access to high-speed internet. You literally, children at every stage, elementary, middle, high school, cannot do their homework without access to the internet. Well, in so many communities, there's no broadband. So that's part of my plan also, is a very robust investment, like we had generations ago in creating electrical lines in the United States so everyone would have electricity. Remember, that didn't just pop up. There was a federal investment in understanding people needed to have access to electricity. Same thing with broadband. And go online to kamalaharris.org and you'll see my plan.
I think we've got one more. Yes, she's coming to you.
Hi, I'm Maya Schofield. I'm a sophomore here at Benedict College. While changing how we address drugs in this country, use of essential to reform our system, any real moves away from mass incarceration and mass punishment will require us to rethink how we respond to violence, acts as well. Senator Harris, what is your vision about how we respond to violence in more effective and humane ways?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. It's a wonderful question. So a number of things. There is an associated issue that we are not talking enough about, which is childhood trauma. And that's about children who are growing up, experiencing trauma that comes with growing up in a household where there's violence and that crosses socioeconomic lines, a community where there's violence, or growing up in poverty, because be clear, poverty is trauma-inducing. And we have one of the biggest public policy failures in America is mental health. It's the biggest public policy failure, the failure to invest in mental health. You know, when we talk about health care, it's all about the neck down. Instead of understanding what happens from the neck up, has a whole lot to do with everything that you just raised in your question. So, one, it's about investment in mental health, starting with early childhood trauma and what we need to do there. Back to the earlier question, I actually, as part of my education plan, will put a teacher and a social worker in every school. Okay, but it is also about, then to your point, about substance abuse, right? Which can lead to violent behaviors, because it just exasperates, it highlights what otherwise might be things that we need to address that are also about mental health. And so that's all about, again, what we need to do to put resources into substance abuse treatment, into mental health treatment. Part of my Medicare for All plan is that we will have substance abuse treatment and mental health care on demand. Another part of it is back to the broadband point. So again, in so many of our rural communities, the hospitals have shut down or the specialists are not there. Well, what mental health leaders will tell you is a very good second option is telemedicine, right? Being able to talk to somebody on a screen in real time. Well, if you don't have broadband, you can't do that. So yet again, on the issue of broadband, it comes down to what we need to do around education, but also what we need to do around health care. And when I think health care, I think mental health as much as I do a broken elbow. And that's it. And then we also just need to talk about it more. Because in particular, interpersonal violence, meaning between people who are in a relationship of trust, is something we still do not talk about. And there's lots of stigma and embarrassment associated with it. You know, there was a time, and it still exists today, where people say, oh, that's private business. And but it's not. And it shouldn't be treated that way, and we need to talk about that too so we can end those cycles. So there's a lot there, but voicing the issue is the beginning of it. So thank you for your leadership. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Harris, I think as we come to the close of our time here, I know it's been phenomenal just to have these students ask you questions. Can you give us your final thoughts, particularly around the issue of criminal justice reform, first 100 days?
Yeah. What
do you do as our next president around the issue of criminal justice reform, particularly equity and inclusion, making sure that people have an opportunity for a fresh start at life?
Well, one, on day one, we're going to shut down those private prisons. Which, again, under the Trump administration, they have doubled the funding of these private prisons. And be clear about that. The business model there is that some people are making a lot of money. They're profiting off the incarceration of other human beings. There should never be a profit motive associated with incarceration. So there is that piece of it. But it gets back to the earlier conversation. In order to reform the criminal justice system, we have to look at it around and see my plan around what we need to do to end the mass incarceration issue that has been plaguing our nation for decades, and that includes sentencing reform, it includes exonerations, it includes expungements, it includes what we need to do around also retroactively looking at what has happened in terms of and innocence projects and funding DNA and all of that, right? There is the piece of it that is about taking the profit out of the system immediately around everything from bail to private prisons. There is the incarcerated women issue and families and understanding how families are impacted by the way that the criminal justice system works. And it is also, and on day one, I'm really looking forward. I mean, one of the most joyous moments I'm going to have is saying thank you and goodbye to Betsy DeVos. Um, it's just going to be like, you know, it'll be that moment. But I say that to say that it is also about, back to the point about healthy communities, right? So there needs to be law enforcement accountability. I think I'm one of the only, but I know it, my plan, because I know it, is unique around the law enforcement accountability, is not, that in addition to police, it needs to be about prosecutors. In fact, you'll see on my plan that I'm going to give the Department of Justice of the United States explicit authority to investigate prosecutors' offices for patterns and practice of discrimination and abuse of power where it exists. That needs to happen. But back to safe communities. That's about having a Secretary of Education who understands the role that our public education system needs to play in dealing with this around early detection, around prevention and things like that. It's about having a Department of Labor and a Secretary of Labor who understands, as I did when I created Back on Track based in the early 2000s, that, nothing, talk about violence, nothing stops a bullet like a job. And helping, and so making sure that we are helping the young people of our communities, in particular those who are highest at risk, for jobs and job training and apprenticeship programs. It means having a Secretary of Health and Human Services who understands the situation that it is rampant in our communities around childhood trauma, undetected, undiagnosed, untreated, and addressing that with resources that are targeted to those communities that we know are most in need. And you get the point. So it is about assembling a cabinet that understands its role and responsibility, because we have got to take the responsibility for healthy and safe communities out of law enforcement. And by that, we will then reduce the need for law enforcement.
That's fantastic, Senator. We've got a young leader who has another question.
Okay.
And we're going to throw him a lifeline and give him a chance to ask you a final question.
Okay, good.
Hi,
We're going to take two questions. This young man first.
Okay.
How you doing?
How you doing?
Jordan Watkins. I'm a business major from Columbia, South Carolina.
Okay.
I'm a big fan of your work. My question was based off of juveniles and how would you go about expunging their records? Because in my community, I say by the time you're about 17, a lot of kids end up catching a charge. And I'm not speaking about just a marijuana expungement.
Yeah.
What would you do about a actual criminal offense?
Yeah.
And how would you go about allowing them to expunge their record and be able to go to college?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Watkins. That's a great question and a great point, because when we talk about reform of the criminal justice system, we've got to understand that the juvenile justice system is in dire need of reform. And I know that, and I've seen it. And so immediately it starts with, and I urge you to see my whole criminal justice reform detailed plan of action, which includes that children not being charged as adults, which includes that I will end solitary confinement of juveniles, which includes what we need to do to talk about and have a commitment for less incarceration of juveniles, and have guidelines in terms of exactly what those numbers should be, because right now in so many states, children are being incarcerated for, a child being incarcerated for a couple of days is traumatic, much less the weeks, months, and years that we're seeing that happen. And so part of my plan is also a reduction of that. And then also, again, what we need to do about demilitarizing our schools, and taking police officers out of schools. We need to deal with the reality and speak the truth about the inequities around school discipline, where in particular black and brown boys are being expelled and or suspended as young as in elementary school. Yeah. Right? So, because we have to look at all the pipelines, right? We talk about it in terms of the from the crib to the prison. We have to look at all of how this develops. So those are some of my main areas of focus, because it has to be a lot of the young people that we're talking about. It is around what happens around school. It is around what happens around incarceration, which leads to, there's some studies I've seen and I know about that the longer that a youth is incarcerated, the more likely they are to reoffend. It's the beginning of cycles. And so we need to stop the cycles at the very beginning.
Excellent.
So thank you for that. Thank you for that.
And we have one more question.
Hello, Senator Harris. How are you?
How you doing?
I'm doing well. My name is Alvin Shepard Jr. I am from Georgetown, South Carolina. My major is Child and Family Development. And my question is, on yesterday, while on campus, President Trump talked about how the First Step Act was the biggest advancement in criminal justice. However, I'm still unclear about how many people it will affect from freeing people from prison and where the funding is going to come from to fully implement the program. My question for you is, what are your thoughts on the First Step Act and President Trump's statement from yesterday? What will the second step you will accomplish to reforming the criminal justice system in your first 100 days?
Yeah. So I've said what I have to say about Donald Trump. I mean, I've got more to say, to be sure. But I just find it hypocritical of him to tout whatever advances have been created because of the First Step Act, given his history and how he has assembled his cabinet, including his attorneys general, because he's had more than one, around how they have run the United States Department of Justice. Putting that, right. Including the current Attorney General of the United States. I mean, back to our youth and anybody in the system. The hypocrisy is deafening, right? So you have an Attorney General of the United States who is supposed to be upholding justice. He's supposed to be the people's lawyer. And you've got him prancing around as the personal lawyer of Donald Trump. And it seems, we will find out, attempting to contribute to a suppression of evidence. How are people supposed to walk into courtrooms around America and have any confidence that what happens to them in a courtroom is fair when you have the highest level elected people or appointed people in the United States in the open, in plain sight, subverting justice? So that being said, I question any statement that he makes on the subject, both in terms of motivation but also factual accuracy. And on the First Step Act, it was a fine first step, but like we need to take that second through 10 step real quickly, because again, back to the point about retroactivity, meaning dealing with, so it's one thing to say you're going to reform the system starting today, but that doesn't do anything for the hundreds and thousands of people who have been under the previous system and are still living under it, incarcerated or walking around with felony convictions that prohibit them from having, and that's part of my plan also, that undoing all of these bans on the previously incarcerated from having access to federal support around housing, federal support around loans and student loans, federal support around all of the benefits that should flow to somebody. So there is that. The First Step Act is not, it does not deal also with what we need to do moving forward around issues like, I want to have a meaningful initiative around re-entering the formerly incarcerated and putting resources into helping them get jobs and support. Because if we're going to say that we're just going to release people and not help them, then we're setting them up for failure. And so that's a big part of what has to happen as the second step. Because the last thing we want is a bunch of people saying, see, I told you so. Because we're setting people up for failure. So there are many second steps that we need to take. I invite you to take a look at my plan. It also includes, again, what we need to do around tracking the injustices in the system. I know that Ted James talked about my background in terms of creating in the California Department of Justice an open data system so that all that information that you know intuitively shows the disparities and inequities, actually requiring government to show it and make it public. But the other thing is, as part of my plan, which is actually very exciting, although it may sound wonky, requiring local law enforcement and the criminal justice system in every county to report up its numbers. So like the National Transportation Safety Board, there will be a board that tracks it and then publishes the numbers around what is happening around sentencing, what is happening around charging, things like that, so we can track it, so that no longer will we have to protest out of pain about what we know to be the inequities based on experience. We are now going to require that these systems report these numbers, because they're not, in a way that we can track it and push for reform, because it's just going to be right there and there's no denying it.
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Kamala Harris.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you.